In the year 121 AD, a new work was published in Rome by Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus, a secretary to the Emperor Hadrian. De Vita Caesarum, or On the Lives of the Caesars, was not the kind of book that could have been written back in the days of the Roman Republic. It offered 12 biographies of the rulers of Rome, from Julius Caesar down to the Emperor Domitian, who had been assassinated a quarter of a century before Suetonius published his book. While there were many individuals who merited close study during the history of the Roman Republic, men like Scipio Africanus and Gaius Marius, these had not been rulers of the Roman state. Suetonius's book indicated that something fundamentally different had begun in the time of Julius Caesar. A tradition had been established whereby a sole individual was considered to be the primary ruler of the state. The Lives of the Caesars sought to explore who these individuals were and how the first century and a half of the Roman Empire, which had succeeded from the Roman Republic, had progressed. This is the story of the Roman Empire that Suetonius was seeking to understand. It is notable that Suetonius did not use the word emperor or imperator in the title of his book. In some ways, it simply indicated that the first of the Roman emperors, Caesar Augustus, had done his job well. He established the imperial system in 27 BC. One of his main goals in doing so had been to disguise the very fact that he was creating a system of absolute rule. The Romans disliked the idea of being subservient to one man and scorned Oriental forms of kingship, which placed one person above all others. It was because of this that Augustus designed the imperial system the way he did in 27 BC. Back then, he was still known widely as Octavian, the great-nephew of Julius Caesar, who had been assassinated in 44 BC after claiming dictatorial powers over the Roman Republic. In the power struggle that followed, Octavian had emerged victorious over his rival Mark Antony in 30 BC. In the years after that, Octavian had deliberated on what sort of system he should put in place to avoid the impression that he was creating a monarchy. Therefore, when he came to the Roman Senate in 27 BC with a series of reforms, they were designed to copper-fasten his control over the state with the surface appearance of respecting the traditions of the Republic. Firstly, Octavian did not claim to be a king. Instead, he framed his reforms as being designed to make him the first citizen of Rome, yet a citizen all the same. The expression used by the Senate when confirming this was princeps senatus, princeps civitatis, meaning first among the senators, first among the citizens. He then monopolized existing republican offices into his hands, such as that of tribune of the plebeians, and he would also regularly hold the office of consul. Soon he would take the office of chief priest of Rome, the Pontifex Maximus as well. To further symbolize his changed status, Octavian adopted a new name. Henceforth, he would be called Caesar Augustus. Augustus was a term meaning venerable, while Caesar was in honor of his great-uncle Julius Caesar. Finally, Octavian added one more term to his list of honors. He would carry the honorific title imperator, meaning commander or conqueror. It is from this word that the name by which we typically know Augustus and his successors derives, emperors. We are fortunate to know a lot about Augustus and his many successors in the 2 centuries that followed. There are large parts of the history of the Roman Republic, and even more so the Kingdom of Rome that preceded it, that very little is known about, or where we do have sources, they are of dubious accuracy. This is no longer the case when it comes to Augustus's reign and the period that followed. The Romans had firmly adopted the habit of writing histories of their time, which the Greeks had pioneered hundreds of years earlier. Furthermore, historical biography was a rising form, and we have two ancient historians, Suetonius and Plutarch, who wrote biographies of many of the Roman emperors from Augustus onwards. Perhaps the most somber and studious of all the Roman historians, Tacitus, wrote two works, the Annals and Histories, which cover Roman history through the Julio-Claudian dynasty that Augustus established and the Flavian dynasty that came after it. There's a wealth of further information to be extrapolated from works that aren't even histories. Plays by figures like Seneca reflect the events of the time, while poems by Ovid and others poke fun at Roman society and in doing so shed light on the social mores of the time. Finally, there are buildings all around Rome that show us how the city looked in imperial times. Virtually all of the ruins that still stand in the Eternal City date to the period of the Empire, not the Republic. And if that were not enough, a volcano in 79 AD preserved an entire town underneath volcanic ash to provide one of the most extraordinary testaments to how an ancient people lived. Archaeologists began excavating Pompeii nearly 300 years ago, and it's still revealing new secrets today. Augustus had a lot of work to do as Rome's first emperor. The Roman Republic had been at war endlessly for hundreds of years prior to his accession and had risen from being a small city-state in central Italy to dominating the entire Mediterranean world. In the last century or so prior to his rise to power, there had been constant social unrest and multiple civil wars. It was a strange contrast, a state that conquered all before it when it came to its neighbors, even while it was at war with itself. This had left little time for the fixing of the many social and economic issues that plagued Roman society. Augustus now set about remedying these. A major issue was the Roman military. Gaius Marius had reformed the army in the late 2nd century BC to create a professional standing force. However, more work needed to be done. The civil wars and wars of conquest had seen hundreds of thousands of legionaries employed, and many of them had not been adequately rewarded in retirement. There were also too many men employed in 27 BC. If he wanted to avoid a new rival emerging, Augustus needed to demobilize many of these soldiers and pension them off. He set on the idea of rewarding retired legionaries with lands in Italy and places like Gaul that his great-uncle had conquered. Then he reformed the structure of the military, while also reframing the Praetorian Guard to become a sort of imperial bodyguard that were the only soldiers allowed within Rome and the Italian peninsula. To secure stability within the city of Rome itself, a teeming metropolis that would grow to around 1 million inhabitants at its height under the empire, he expanded the Cura Annoni, the grain dole which distributed free grain to the citizens of the city. A rash of other work concerned the building of roads, the organization of trade, and many other reforms. After decades of chaos, peace, order, and stability would be the hallmarks of Augustus's reign. Of course, peace was the hoped-for luxury of the Romans at home. Early on in his reign, Augustus continued to expand the empire abroad. Much of his military activity early on in his time as emperor centered on the final pacification of northern Spain, where certain native groups continued to hold out against Roman rule in the mountains of Cantabria 2 centuries after Rome had first begun conquering Hispania. An expedition under Aelius Gallus was also sent into the Arabian Peninsula to examine the possibility of annexing this region and its valuable spice trade. However, the Romans eventually settled on establishing the Nabateans of Petra as a client people and avoided direct involvement here. An expedition was even sent into the Sahara Desert under Lucius Cornelius Balbus to explore the possibility of further southern expansion in that direction. He traveled as far south as Mali, yet evidently returned with a warning that just sand and heat were to be found to the south. Instead, Augustus looked northwards and determined that he would emulate his great-uncle's achievement in conquering Gaul in what is now France by adding Germania to the east of it to the empire. As he focused his attentions here, Augustus managed to maintain peaceful relations with the Parthian Empire on the eastern frontier. Initially, the campaign to conquer Germania went well. The River Rhine was established as a preliminary border, and Augustus next set his sights on advancing to the River Elbe. However, in 9 AD, towards the end of his reign, a large Roman army was drawn into an ambush in the Teutoburg forest in northern Germany, and 3 legions were destroyed. With this setback, Augustus ordered a retreat back to the River Rhine and abandoned plans for further expansion. Moreover, he left advice that his successors should now focus on consolidating Rome's huge empire and not seek to expand any further, using the Sahara Desert in the south and the Rhine and Danube rivers in the north as natural frontiers that could be easily defended. Augustus established the Principate or imperial system when he was still just in his mid-30s. He lived a long life down to his mid-70s and was the longest reigning emperor in the history of the Roman Empire. As a result, he was able to transform many elements of Roman life during the course of his reign. One of the most profound changes was in the very appearance of the Eternal City. As one source puts it, Augustus was said to have stated that he found Rome a city of brick and left it as one of marble. This was not an empty boast. Augustus did transform the city by erecting many new public buildings and spaces. The centerpiece of this was on the Palatine Hill, one of the 7 hills of Rome in the center of the city. Here Augustus laid out his forum, a large civic space of temples and other civic buildings. A centerpiece was the imposing temple of Mars Ultor, dedicated to the Roman god of war. The forum was adorned with over 100 large statues of heroes of the Roman Republic. Augustus also built the first imperial palace, the House of Augustus, on the Palatine Hill. Many other projects were patronized by him. His closest allies and lieutenants financed building work too. For instance, his most loyal ally, Marcus Agrippa, built the first major public baths in Rome. Attuned to the need for public spaces like this and the benefits of bread and circuses in pacifying the Roman masses, Augustus funded the redevelopment of the Circus Maximus, the chariot racing arena in the city. He paid for the transportation of a giant obelisk from Egypt all the way to Rome to be set up at the circus. This all occurred within Rome itself. However, Augustus's building program also extended to the provinces and beyond. There was even a temple dedicated to Augustus in faraway India for Roman traders to visit. The program of imperial propaganda also found expression in the arts and literature of the period. Augustan culture is generally viewed as a golden age for Roman writing and the arts. The preeminent figure was already well established when Augustus founded the Principate. This was the poet Virgil. His eclogues and georgics were quite traditional examples of Roman pastoral poetry, in which he had praised the rustic qualities of the Roman people. His magnum opus, though, was the Aeneid, an epic prose work telling the story of Prince Aeneas of Troy and his travels around the Mediterranean after the siege of Troy. He eventually founds the city of Alba Longa, from the royal line of which Romulus, the founder and first king of Rome, would emerge. It was a national myth echoing Homer's Trojan cycle and establishing the idea that the Romans were the descendants of the ancient Trojans. There were many other great writers during this period. The love poet Ovid was probably the most diverse. Beyond his amorous and often bawdy love poetry, he wrote substantial works on subjects like the Roman calendar and Greek and Roman religion and mythology, the Fasti and Metamorphoses. The historian Titus Livius wrote one of the most important historical works of the ancient world, tracing the history of Rome right back to its mythical foundation. What is notable is that nearly all of these individuals were associated with the imperial court in some way. Many of them were patronized directly by Augustus, or one of the great literary patrons of Roman history, Augustus's friend Gaius Maecenas. Still, as with everything from the ancient world, much has been lost. The very end of the Republican period had seen Marcus Terentius Varro write an enormous array of books on different subjects. It's completely clear from references to him by other Roman writers that Varro was considered to be one of the greatest scholars of the ancient world. And yet, virtually everything that he wrote has been lost. A few texts have survived and fragments quoted second-hand in the writings of others, but little more. It's an indication of how even the most revered of ancient writers can have been lost to the vagaries of time. Even by the time Virgil was writing the Aeneid early in Augustus's reign, the question of the succession was troubling the first emperor. He had fallen quite ill just a few years into his rule, and there were concerns that he would die at the time. Although he recovered, it did bring home to him the necessity of establishing where the line of succession lay. There was no precedent for this, and it did not automatically follow that a male member of his family would succeed. After all, Augustus was at pains to try and establish that this was not a monarchy. In any event, he did not have a son. He only had one biological child, Julia the Elder, from his second marriage. But through his third marriage to Livia Drusilla, he had several adopted children. Thus, after his illness and the crisis it caused, Augustus initially determined that his loyal commander, Marcus Agrippa, would be his designated successor. To that end, he had Agrippa divorce his wife and marry his daughter Julia. But Agrippa died in 12 BC, opening the succession debate again. Augustus's biological grandchildren through Julia's marriage to Agrippa were the obvious next candidates. However, two of the grandsons died in quick succession in 2 AD and 4 AD, and a third was removed from the line of succession on account of his violent character, a worrying sign of issues that lay ahead with the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Eventually, Augustus was forced to turn to his adopted sons from Livia's earlier marriage. The heir he settled on in the end was Tiberius. When Augustus finally died on the 19th of August 14 AD, Tiberius became the second emperor of Rome. The histories of the Julio-Claudian dynasty would have us believe that after Augustus had agonized for so long over the succession, he was still succeeded by a very poor ruler. Tiberius was aloof and spent many years living away from Rome. He also had very questionable judgment that resulted in him placing excessive power in the hands of others and was even a sexual predator. This, at least, is how Suetonius in particular depicted him. The problem is that Suetonius was not always the most honest of observers. His lives of the Caesars might best be described as a cross between a serious history book and salacious bits of gossip, often peppering his writings with things that were patently untrue, right alongside hard evidential accounts of the reigns of the emperors. There was, however, also a political motive beneath this. Many of the emperors were deemed by Roman society to have not shown due deference to the honor of the senatorial class at Rome, and where they did so, they were lambasted by Suetonius and Tacitus alike. In Tiberius's case, he was criticized in particular for essentially devolving power into the hands of the Praetorian prefect, Sejanus, while the emperor absconded to his pleasure palace on the island of Capri. Eventually, Sejanus was arrested on charges of treason and executed in 31 AD. Even following this, Tiberius continued to absent himself from Rome and ruled through proxies. He was a peculiar second emperor, and it is hard to know what to make of him. He probably was not the deviant Suetonius made him out to be. At the same time, he seems to have had little interest in being the most powerful man in the world. Tiberius finally died in 37 AD at 77 years of age. Suetonius and others claimed that Rome rejoiced at the death of the recluse and the ascent of a new emperor. Gaius Caesar Augustus Germanicus was the great-grandson of Caesar Augustus, the son of Germanicus, a revered military hero of the imperial family. The new emperor was known as Caligula, meaning Little Boot, a nickname he had been given as a toddler in the army camps of Germania with his father. Unfortunately, Caligula turned out to be nothing like his well-revered father, or indeed his idolized great-grandfather. By all accounts, he was a lunatic and a tyrant, one who tried to undermine the careful balance of power between emperor and senate that Augustus had established. At Rome and around Italy, he engaged in a series of building projects that were often wasteful of public money. He demanded that he should be worshipped as a god, humiliated members of the Senate, and tried to have a statue of himself erected in the Temple of Jerusalem, a grave insult to the Jewish people. Caligula even allegedly tried to have his horse appointed as a consul, the senior-most political office in Rome. This was all too much for the imperial establishment, and in 41 AD, just 4 years into his reign, the Praetorian Guard murdered him in Rome. In the midst of the chaos surrounding the murder, they found his uncle Claudius hiding behind a curtain in the imperial palace. Claudius had been born with a limp, a condition which had previously removed him from consideration for high office, but in the tumult following the murder of Caligula, the Praetorian Guard decided Claudius would make a fine emperor. Perhaps they considered that he would be biddable and easy to manipulate. Whatever the motive, he turned out, on balance, to be the best of the Julio-Claudian emperors after Augustus himself. He would reign down to 54 AD. Claudius's reign is notable for one thing in particular: the beginning of the conquest of Britain. The people of the Mediterranean had known about Britain for centuries. For instance, the Greek explorer and writer Pytheas of Massalia had visited the island in the late 4th century BC. Julius Caesar had crossed over to the island during his conquest of Gaul and was evidently considering the possibility of conquering Britain at some future point. Nevertheless, Augustus's advice to his successors had been simple: to not expand the empire any further and to consolidate control over the vast lands that had been conquered. Claudius was the first of his successors to ignore this advice. In 43 AD, 2 years into his reign, he launched an invasion of Britain. At the time, the island was inhabited, much like Gaul had been, by a patchwork of different Celtic tribes, some more powerful than others. they were capable of putting up a more united defense of their island home when they needed to, and the conquest of Britain would be a slow affair. Claudius succeeded in securing the southern coastal regions, and the Romans gradually expanded northwards in the decades that followed. By the 60s AD, they were still trying to pacify the Midlands and Wales. There is an unusually detailed account of some of these events in the Agricola, written by the Roman historian Tacitus on the life of his father-in-law, Gnaeus Julius Agricola, who served as governor of Britain between 77 AD and 85 AD. He completed the conquest of Wales and England and launched the most successful campaign into what was then known as Caledonia, modern-day Scotland. However, the conquest of the northern part of Britain was never fully completed, and, as is well known, the Romans eventually ended up building a physical wall across northern England to act as the northern border. Claudius died under suspicious circumstances in 54 AD. Ancient accounts infer that he was poisoned by his wife Agrippina, who then ensured that her son from her earlier marriage, Nero, succeeded him. This could well be true, or it might be a part of the anti-Nero sentiment which prevailed in later times. Nero is a difficult ruler to figure out. He was later described by writers like Suetonius as a tyrant in the vein of Caligula, a man who was said to have intentionally caused the Great Fire that destroyed much of Rome in 64 AD so that he could clear part of the city and build himself a vast new palace there. Christian writers added to this negative impression centuries later, when they identified Nero as the first emperor to widely persecute the Christians. These views are open to question. Nero was eventually overthrown in 68 AD and died, but immediately thereafter, several claimants to the throne arose who claimed to be Nero. Why, if he was so unpopular, would aspiring claimants have pretended to be Nero? Surely they were appealing to a public sentiment that liked the recently deceased emperor. The image of the tyrannical Nero might well be a construct of both Suetonius and later Christian writers. In any event, even Suetonius admitted that Nero showed a lot of good qualities early on in his reign, and only became tyrannical over time. His 14-year spell as the last emperor of the Julio-Claudian dynasty was also notable for its cultural output. His mentor, Seneca, was one of the great Stoic philosophers, essayists and playwrights of Roman imperial history. A friend of Nero's, Lucan, composed the Pharsalia, an epic poem on the civil war between Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great. Another courtier in Nero's circle, Petronius, wrote the Satyricon, one of the only novels in Latin to have survived from antiquity. All the while, Pliny the Elder was writing his Encyclopedia, the natural history, one of the most wide-ranging texts ever produced in ancient times. As noted, Nero was overthrown in 68 AD. The reasons for the revolt against his rule are multifaceted. There does seem to have been some growing discontent about the manner in which he was governing, especially since the Great Fire of 64 AD and following a conspiracy to murder him in 65 AD led by Gaius Calpurnius Piso, a leading politician of the time. Nero became increasingly paranoid after the Pisonian conspiracy. Added to this was a major revolt in the east in the province of Judea. The Jewish people had proved to be some of the most reluctant subjects of the Roman Empire. Their religious and social customs were often at odds with Roman imperial rule, and Tiberius, Caligula, and Nero had all engaged in policies which provoked Jewish resistance to Roman rule, notably by dishonoring the sanctity of the Temple of Jerusalem. In 66 AD, these resentments exploded into a massive rebellion in the province. Many legions had to be dispatched to the Levant to tackle the problem, and it would drag on years beyond the siege and devastation of Jerusalem in 70 AD. These events provoked several revolts against Nero in 68 AD amongst the governors and commanders in Gaul and Hispania. The Senate then turned on Nero, who fled from Rome and took his own life. He was initially succeeded by a respected senator and provincial governor, Galba, but Galba's rule was established on nothing more than military force and the consent of a section of the Senate. Before long, others decided they too had a chance of seizing the imperial title. Hence, 69 AD became known as the Year of the Four Emperors. Galba was overthrown by Otho in January. He lasted just 3 months before one of the commanders of the Germanic frontier, Vitellius, led his legions south and claimed power in Rome in April. Vitellius was, in turn, overthrown by Vespasian, the senior general in charge of pacifying Judea, who was able to use the legions under his control in the east to defeat Vitellius and establish himself as emperor in the final weeks of 69 AD. Vespasian's full name was Titus Flavius Vespasianus. The Flavius element was the gens or family name. Therefore, the dynasty which he founded is known as the Flavian dynasty. It would have 3 rulers. Vespasian himself ruled between 69 AD and 79 AD. He was then followed by his son Titus, who was very well liked, but who only ruled for 2 years before dying under possibly suspicious circumstances. Then Titus's brother Domitian ascended to the imperial position. He would rule for 15 years. The era of the Flavian dynasty saw important events occur across the empire. The conquest of Britain continued, while tensions escalated along the Danube frontier with the Dacians, a tribe of people who ruled a kingdom in what is now Romania. During Domitian's reign, a new expedition was sent into the Sahara Desert, one led by Julius Maetianus. It seems to have penetrated as far as Lake Chad and what is now the Central African Republic. Expeditions this far into the African interior would not be attempted by Europeans again until the 19th century. Then there were the more bizarre elements of Flavian rule. Vespasian, for instance, was responsible for the so-called urine tax, a tax on the disposal of urine from public toilets in Rome. This makes some sense when we consider that urine was used in many pre-industrial societies as a way of dyeing clothes and cleaning whites. The ammonia removed stains. The past was often an unpleasant place. The short reign of Titus began with one of the most important events in Roman history, or at least one that has allowed us to gain a fascinating insight into Roman life over the centuries. It was previously believed that the eruption of Mount Vesuvius that destroyed the towns of Pompeii and Herculaneum in southern Italy, covering them in mounds of volcanic ash and pumice, occurred on the 24th of August 79 AD. That date is now questioned, and the eruption might have happened in October. The result was the same in any event. Vesuvius spewed out enormous amounts of lava that covered the nearby towns and preserved their remains underneath. As early as the Renaissance period, there were people writing about finding things under the ground in the vicinity of the volcano, and in the 18th century, the first tentative archaeological explorations of Pompeii began. 3 centuries later, there is still about a third of the site yet to be fully excavated. Pompeii, and to a lesser extent Herculaneum, provide a striking window into what life in the Roman Empire was like. This was a highly urbanized society, at least by the standards of the ancient world, with perhaps as much as 25 to 30% of people in Italy living in cities and towns. The rich and poor lived alongside one another, the latter in tenements, the former in villas. Slaves were present everywhere. It is estimated that anywhere between 10 and 25% of Roman society was made up of slaves. The proportion was higher in Italy than in other parts of the empire. This was a pre-industrial society, and agriculture was the primary economic pursuit. Indeed, the prevalence of slavery probably acted as an impediment to the development of industrialization. The Romans, for instance, understood the basic mechanics of a steam engine, but never expanded the use of it. Many would have felt there was no need for mechanized manpower of this kind, when a team of slaves could be used to carry out any menial task. Life in the towns had some surprisingly modern elements to it. There were fast food restaurants called thermopolia, in which food was cooked and then placed in jars along heated counters to keep it warm. The use of large vats of hot water to create heat was used for central heating in the colder provinces, especially during winter months. Large water baths were placed under the floorboards of a corner of a room, and heat radiated out from these makeshift radiators. This was all possible because the Romans built large aqueducts that delivered abundant water into their cities and towns, often simply using gravity to have it roll down from hilltop river sources. These aqueducts and the Roman road system point towards one of the things the Romans were best at: engineering. Much of this was achieved by using Greek knowledge of mathematics and Roman efficiency. A lot of the manual labor was provided by slaves, yet some of it was also carried out, or at least overseen, by the legions. It would be incorrect to think that the legionaries were simply soldiers. As the empire became more peaceful in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, the Pax Romana, or Roman peace as it is sometimes known, meant that work needed to be found for the legionaries stationed in the towns. In due course, the legionaries became a kind of civil service. They acted as a police force to maintain law and order, as well as performing the role of firefighters and numerous other tasks. They would not have been present in Pompeii because of the prohibition on legionaries in Italy itself. But elsewhere, throughout the empire, the Roman military was a constant presence. In fact, anywhere between 60 and 80% of the Roman budget was spent on maintaining the legions. One of the most striking elements of the ruins of Pompeii is the window it provides on religious life in the Roman Empire. As might be expected, the leading deities of the Roman pantheon were worshipped here, and temples to them were in prominent public locations. These included gods like Jupiter, the king of the gods, and the Roman equivalent of Zeus, and his wife Juno. Mars, the god of war, was particularly revered by the Romans to a much greater extent than his Greek equivalent Ares. Minerva, who the Romans equated with Athena in the Greek system, was worshipped prominently at Pompeii as a goddess of justice and trade. The temples and shrines of the city point towards a cosmopolitan mix of religions. For instance, there was a large temple of Apollo in Pompeii. Apollo was the Greek god of music, dance, archery, and the sun. There had been a major revival of his worship in the Greek East in Roman times, and it is unsurprising that a temple was established to him at Pompeii, particularly when we consider that southern Italy had been an extension of the Greek world in centuries gone, where many Greek colonies were settled. More surprising was the discovery all the way back in 1764 of the remains of a temple of Isis at Pompeii. Isis was the Egyptian goddess of the underworld and magic. Worship of her and her brother husband in the Egyptian mythological system, Osiris, revived in Roman times and spread from Egypt throughout much of the Mediterranean. Beyond these paramount deities, the remains of Pompeii show that common people often had shrines in their homes to smaller household deities such as the Penates and Lares, household gods that offerings were made to at mealtimes and who were said to look after the domus or household in return. Finally, there is evidence at Pompeii of the widespread worship of the emperors as deities already at this stage. This would later cause issues within the Roman Empire, as it was the belief that Christian belief in a sole god conflicted with the dues owing to the imperial cult of the emperor. This led to the concerted campaign to persecute the Christians in the second half of the 3rd century AD. Pompeii probably had a population of somewhere around 12,000 people. This was large enough that the town had its own amphitheatre for the staging of plays and the holding of gladiatorial contests. It could fit upwards of 20,000 people, suggesting that on certain occasions people would have streamed into Pompeii to attend events there from the surrounding countryside. It had been built around 70 BC, during the chaotic final decades of the Roman Republic. It was unusual insofar as the amphitheatre was built out of stone and not wood, making it one of the first amphitheatres built anywhere by the Romans from stone. At that juncture, the people of the capital to the north were still attending plays and gladiatorial games in several small amphitheatres built primarily out of wood. They gradually improved until Vespasian commissioned the construction of a vast new amphitheatre early on in his reign. The Flavian amphitheatre, what we now know as the Colosseum today, was only finally completed and opened by his son Titus in 80 AD. It is one of the marvels of Roman architecture and engineering, a building that has been emulated for thousands of years and the design features of which have influenced football stadiums and other sporting theatres all over the world. Initially, it could hold upwards of 60,000 people. Further additions by Domitian meant that its maximum capacity was extended to around 80,000 people, and major subterranean passageways and chambers were added underneath the main arena. The games surrounding the opening of the Flavian amphitheatre in Rome during the short reign of Titus were the high point for the popularity of the dynasty. A year later, Titus died at just 41 years of age. His premature passing inevitably led to suspicions that he had been poisoned or killed in some other way, but there is no evidence to validate this suspicion. The suspicions arose as a result of the subsequent unpopularity of his brother Domitian. Like Nero before him, Domitian was not disliked initially. He was perceived as a relatively competent emperor with a lot of potential. However, over time, he lost the favor of the Roman Senate and was portrayed unfavorably by Suetonius and Tacitus afterwards as a result. The emperors were expected to respect the dignity of the senatorial class by ensuring that the Senate was properly consulted on matters of high policy and by allowing senior families to work their way up through the cursus honorum, the series of Roman magisterial offices that concluded with a spell as consul or being made governor of a province. Domitian's relationship with the Senate broke down over time. He faced revolts and conspiracies by figures like the governor of one of the frontier provinces of Germania, Lucius Antonius Saturninus, in 89 AD, while he also failed to defeat and conquer the Dacians when he clashed with them on the Danube frontier. This culminated in 96 AD in a conspiracy that involved elements of the imperial staff, the Praetorian Guard, and the Senate. Domitian was assassinated in his imperial quarters, and the Senate quickly moved to elect an elderly senator, Marcus Cocceius Nerva, as the next emperor. In doing so, they began a process whereby the emperors over the next century became semi-elective, although there were ties of blood between most of them. This has become known as the era of the 5 good emperors. The culture of the Roman Empire during this period is often unfairly overlooked, standing in the shadow of that which prevailed about 100 years earlier under Augustus, when writers like Virgil, Ovid, and Horace had written some of Rome's great works. The writers of the Flavian era and the early 2nd century might not have matched Virgil, yet they were very important in their own way. This was, for instance, the golden age of Roman satire. Two writers, Martial and Juvenal, produced a series of satires and epigrams which critiqued life in imperial Rome and the social mores of the time. There was a serious quality to these too. Juvenal was responsible for the refrain that the Roman people were satiated by bread and circuses. It appeared in a passage in which he lambasted the way ordinary Romans no longer really played any role in public life. Martial referenced the work of one of the other great poets of the era in his epigrams. This was the Punica, written by Silius Italicus. It is the longest surviving epic poem from the ancient world and tells the story of the Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage in the 3rd century BC. Italicus is not well known in the modern world, nor is his contemporary Quintilian. Quintilian was an educator and rhetorician who taught some of the most learned scholars of Rome in the 70s and 80s AD. He was revered in the Renaissance period as the paragon of rhetorical skill alongside Cicero. Finally, during this era, Rome played host to some of the most accomplished historians of the ancient world. Suetonius and Tacitus are the two most prominent. A third was Josephus Flavius, a Romanized Jewish scholar, who composed a series of works on the Jewish revolt and other elements of Jewish history after he relocated to Rome in the employ of the Flavians after the war that so disrupted his homeland. The literary outpouring was complemented by a kind of revival of Greek culture in the eastern provinces, a period that has become known as the Second Sophistic. The name is derived from the word sophists that was used to describe the philosophers and debaters that were the main scholars of ancient Greece during the classical era of the 5th and 4th centuries BC. This Second Sophistic was a period in which their interest in a wide range of genres was revived in a tangible way. A central figure was Plutarch, the Greco-Roman historical biographer who composed a set of parallel lives which compared the lives of prominent Greeks and Romans. They are some of the best sources for studying the lives of key individuals from ancient Greek history in particular. Plutarch, though, was more than a historical biographer, and his Moralia and other works provide an insight into Greek philosophy at this time, and even the worship of Egyptian deities like Isis and Osiris. Another notable writer of the Second Sophistic was Pausanias. He composed a kind of ancient travel guide that provided a written journey through the main temples and tourist sites of the Greek world. Many of the monuments, temples, statues, and other buildings he described have long since disappeared, so his guide often provides our best source for reconstructing what some of the great buildings and temples of the Greek world looked like in ancient times. There were many other leading writers of the Second Sophistic. Amongst them, Lucian of Samosata deserves the most praise. Lucian is not exactly a household name in modern times, yet he was a much revered author in centuries gone by. His short stories and longer works like A True Story could arguably be called the first works of science fiction. They also were a major influence in later times on writers like Thomas More in his Utopia and François Rabelais in Gargantua and Pantagruel. Nerva's reign as Emperor of Rome was a short one. He was already in his 60s when he was made emperor by the consent of the Senate, and his appointment has the air of a stopgap measure until a more concrete candidate could be found to succeed him. The eventual successor, less than a year and a half later, at the beginning of 98 AD, was Marcus Ulpius Traianus, usually referred to simply as Trajan. Trajan was considered by many Romans to be their greatest emperor. Years later, it was a common refrain when an emperor succeeded to say, Felicior Augusto, Melior Traiano, meaning, "May you be as fortunate as Augustus, and better than Trajan," indicating that he was the mark to aspire to. This view of Trajan was based entirely on his military exploits. No emperor extended the empire as successfully as he did. In the Balkans, he conquered the kingdom of Dacia and began transforming it into one of the more Romanized provinces of the empire. It is known today as Romania, the land of the Romans. In 106 AD, he annexed the Nabatean kingdom, bringing the Negev desert, parts of Jordan, and northwestern Arabia under direct Roman rule. This was important in terms of controlling the lucrative spice trade through this region. Finally, in 115 AD, he launched a new war against Rome's eastern enemy, the Parthian Empire. Unlike many predecessors, he was strikingly successful in this, conquering Armenia and Mesopotamia in a blistering campaign, and even launching raids into Persia in Central Asia. Trajan had begun organizing these lands into Roman provinces when he died in 117 AD. The conquests in Mesopotamia were abandoned thereafter, as his successor, Hadrian, decided it was impractical to try and retain control of them. Yet the memory of Trajan's accomplishment caused the Romans to view him as their greatest ruler alongside Augustus. Trajan's successor, Hadrian, who ruled from 117 AD to 138 AD, was a very different emperor from Trajan or virtually every other emperor prior to this. He was an administrator and reformer of a kind not seen before. Hadrian spent much of his reign traveling around the empire with an itinerant court, stopping in cities and towns to determine what needed to be fixed in particular places, and then taking steps to do so. One of the most notable elements of this occurred in Britain, where Hadrian ordered the construction of a large wall and series of fortifications across what is now northern England. Hadrian's wall was over 100 kilometers long. It signaled an end to efforts to conquer the Caledonians to the north after decades of trying, and to instead set up an effective border defense against their raids southwards. Elsewhere, he reformed the legal system and ordered the codification of Roman law. He engaged in efforts to restore and expand many cities that had fallen into decline, and was also a great supporter of Greek culture. This aided the scholars of the Second Sophistic, though it contributed to the senatorial classes coming to dislike him. Hadrian was considered overly fond of Greek culture, epitomized in his decision to grow his beard long. His absence from Rome for prolonged periods of time also irked the Roman elite. Not all of his reforms were successful. He had inherited a new rebellion among the Jewish people in the eastern Mediterranean at the start of his reign, and he provoked a third Jewish revolt when he ordered the construction of a new Roman colony on the ruins of Jerusalem, which had never recovered from its devastation during the first Jewish revolt in the time of Vespasian. The third Jewish revolt led to a further flight of Jewish people from Judea, and the diaspora continued to expand during Hadrian's rule. Hadrian's successor is one of the most unremarkable of the Roman emperors. Antoninus Pius ruled the empire for 23 years, down to 161 AD. Despite the length of his reign, there were surprisingly few notable events during most of it. Antoninus did not conquer any new territories, nor did he embark on any ambitious reform program of the kind Hadrian had attempted. It is indicative of the lack of activity during his rule that the decision to try and conquer some of southern Scotland stands out as a proactive measure. He was, by all accounts, simply a measured and unflashy bureaucrat, one who left the treasury a lot fuller at the end of his reign, and who improved numerous elements of Roman life like the supply of drinking water into the cities and towns. These aren't the kind of actions that result in a person being called Antoninus the Great or something similar. However, the free people of the empire would not have had much to complain about during his reign. The Roman peace was at its height, trade flourished, and prosperity reigned. Of this period, the British Enlightenment historian Edward Gibbon, in his monumental The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, would later state, "If a man were called to fix the period in the history of the world during which the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous, he would, without hesitation, name that which elapsed from the death of Domitian to the accession of Commodus." The vast extent of the Roman Empire was governed by absolute power, under the guidance of virtue and wisdom. The armies were restrained by the firm but gentle hand of 4 successive emperors, whose characters and authority commanded involuntary respect. The forms of the civil administration were carefully preserved. Of no reign was this truer than that of Antoninus Pius. Antoninus died in 161 AD and was succeeded by his adopted sons, Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus, the first instance of 2 emperors ruling in tandem. Their joint reign began with an appalling pandemic. It is known today as the Antonine Plague, as the very earliest reports of it in the eastern provinces date to the tail end of the reign of Antoninus. However, it swept across the empire and persisted right through the reign of Marcus Aurelius in the 160s and 170s AD. Exactly what caused the Antonine Plague is still debated. Accounts from the time of how sufferers experienced eruptions on their skin suggest that it was a virulent wave of smallpox that arrived from Asia, to which the people of the Roman Empire had little resistance. Others have suggested it might have been measles, which would also correlate with the symptoms described in the ancient sources. What is beyond doubt, regardless of what the pathology of the disease was, is that it killed millions of people. Later accounts describe thousands of people dying in a matter of days in the larger cities when waves of the disease were at their worst. Estimates of the exact death toll suggest between 10 and 15% of the population of the empire lost their lives in the first waves between 165 AD and 180 AD. Depending on what the population of the empire might have been, this suggests a death toll somewhere between 5 and 10 million people, and it was not the only deadly wave of the disease. Fresh waves occurred again towards the end of the 2nd century and would continue to plague the empire and its people for several years to come. It might have been the Antonine Plague which claimed the life of Lucius Verus in 169 AD. His passing meant that Rome reverted to having just one emperor, Marcus Aurelius. Aurelius is one of the most well-known Roman emperors today. This is primarily on account of the series of notebooks he kept, recording his views on Stoic philosophy and other parts of moral life. They were subsequently published as the Meditations. 3 other aspects of Aurelius's life and reign stand out. Firstly, Aurelius's Stoic disposition was probably aided to a good extent by his opiate consumption. He consumed a theriac on a daily basis, a sort of potion used against poisoning and other ailments, which included a strong pinch of opium. Secondly, he waged war on the Parthian Empire in the first years of his reign. During the course of this, a Roman army penetrated into Mesopotamia again, much as Trajan had a half-century earlier, though with less success in defeating the Parthians. This war is generally overlooked in accounts of the reign, though, in favor of examining the third and most important aspect of the reign, the Marcomannic Wars. These were fought over a period of nearly 15 years between 166 AD and 180 AD in Central Europe. The Romans had fixed their northern border along the course of the Rhine and Danube rivers. There was, though, a weakness in this border defense, a long section of land between the Rhine and the Danube which had to be protected without a large riverine defense. In the mid-160s AD, a large confederacy of Germanic groups, led by the Marcomanni and including the Quadi and Sarmatians, burst through the border here and occupied lands around the provinces of Noricum and Pannonia, in what are now Austria and Croatia. This threatened the security of northern Italy and could not be tolerated. Over an extensive series of campaigns, the Romans would defeat the Marcomanni and their allies and would clear them out of their lands here. Yet these wars were significant. They pointed towards a fragility in the northern border and tribes beyond it that were becoming more aggressive and ambitious when it came to plundering the Roman provinces. Marcus Aurelius followed a well-established practice in his final years of making his designated successor his co-emperor. The idea was that the senior emperor would train the junior figure, so that he didn't arrive to the position inexperienced about how the imperial government and army worked, or indeed how to handle the Senate. What was unusual about Aurelius's decision was that he was the first emperor since the time of the Flavian dynasty 100 years earlier to make his biological son, Commodus, his heir. The 5 good emperors had generally been selected on their merits and then adopted by the serving emperor, albeit many were cousins of one another. Aurelius did not follow this custom, and when he died in 180 AD, he was succeeded by Commodus. The reign fits a well-established pattern for bad emperors. Like Nero and Domitian before him, things did not start out too badly. Nevertheless, before long, just like Nero and Tiberius before him, Commodus began ignoring the established methods of governance and instead devolved extensive power into the hands of several freed slaves and prefects of the Praetorian Guard. Then things got really peculiar in a way which mirrors Caligula's behavior. Commodus became increasingly tyrannical and demanded that he should be worshipped as a god. He broke completely with the Senate and began performing in the gladiatorial contests in the Flavian amphitheatre in Rome. As if to cement the perception of him as a latter-day Nero, a major fire swept through Rome in 191 AD, creating further disillusionment with Commodus's rule, just as had occurred back in 64 AD with Nero. After this, Commodus decided that he was a latter-day Romulus and that he wanted to create a new calendar in which every month of the year would be named after him in one way or another. Even Julius Caesar had been content to just have July named after himself. It was all too much for the various constituencies of people that made up Roman political life, the senators, the imperial staff, and the military. On New Year's Eve, 192 AD, after returning from a bout of slaughter at the Colosseum, Commodus was strangled to death in his bathtub by a wrestler named Narcissus. A senator and former military commander, Pertinax, was proclaimed emperor within hours. Yet this was just the beginning of a lengthy civil war and an even longer period of crisis that characterized life in the Roman Empire for hundreds of years to come. Commodus is often portrayed as a villain of the Roman Empire, a reckless ruler who was the antithesis of his father and whose reign ushered in a period of crisis and decline. There is a small element of truth to this, and Rome would indeed descend into a period of crisis and decline in the 3rd century. Nevertheless, in reality, there were already many signs of the trouble ahead, even during the supposed golden age of the 5 good emperors. The 3 key features of Rome's crisis in the 3rd century were economic instability, a political crisis which saw a rapid turnover of emperors as the military became too powerful and engaged in perpetual civil wars, and the invasion of the empire's northern borders by Germanic and Asiatic groups anxious to acquire its wealth. In all 3 instances, there were symptoms of these issues already present in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. It was the Praetorian Guard that had overthrown Caligula in 41 AD and crowned a new emperor, albeit sticking with a member of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. The legions and the Praetorian Guard had also played a role in the overthrow of emperors in 68 AD and 96 AD, and would again immediately after Commodus's death. Similarly, while the economic crisis of the 3rd century would eclipse anything that went before it, Roman emperors such as Trajan had already resorted to lowering the silver content of the Roman coins to pay for a larger military establishment in the early 2nd century. Furthermore, when it came to Rome's borders, Marcus Aurelius's reign and the incursion of the Marcomanni into the border zone near the source of the Danube had provided a portent of what was to come in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries. The 2nd century might have been the golden age of the Roman Empire, as Gibbon suggested, but as with so many other empires, the zenith of its power disguised the many flaws which held the system up. As we will see in the 3rd and final part of this history of Rome, the golden age of the 5 good emperors was soon followed by an immense crisis in the 3rd century. What do you think of the Roman Empire? Was it really a good time to be alive, like Gibbon argued? Or was it an empire with many underlying problems? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.